Okay, ladies and gentlemen, today I'm going to be talking about Popper and critical rationalism, and the lecture for today is on Popper and Marx. Despite an older friend of his having warned Popper when he was a young man against Marxism, Popper became a Marxist in his mid-teens. And as Bill Bartley has mentioned in the one chapter from his projected biography of Popper, which is available, and as Malachi Harcohen has then discussed, Popper actually works inside the offices of the Austrian Communist Party. It was a small organization, but his volunteering of working for them was accepted, and so he was actually working inside their office. As Popper has recounted many, many times, the death of some workers in a demonstration, which I've seen claimed was actually an attempted revolution, led Popper to reconsider the claims of Marxism to merit a scientific status. And Popper himself, on reflecting on this, shifted from communism to being a socialist. The Social Democrats in Austria, the main political party on the left, were also themselves predominantly Marxists. Popper became critical of the consequences of their ideas, influenced by Marxism, for the conduct of politics. And in many ways, the Open Society, where it's discussing some of the practical consequences of Marxism, can be read as Popper's critical reflections on the operations of Austrian social democracy. In his Open Society, Popper is particularly critical of the ambiguity that they displayed towards violence and towards democracy, which, in his view, undermined their being able to effectively oppose explicitly anti-democratic movements, while those who were explicitly communist opposed ideas about the formation of a popular front against the far right. Popper also seemed to be concerned in practical terms about the issue of bureaucracy and how and whether it could be controlled. He'd had an unhappy personal experience with the bureaucracy in Vienna. I believe that he recounts in his autobiography that he had complained that some apparatus in a school yard was defective. No action had been taken about this. A pupil then was hurt by climbing on it, and he was then being held responsible for the problem that was encountered by the bureaucracy. And so he was struck both in practical terms, but also just in theoretical terms by how socialism was supposed to handle bureaucracy. And he really, I think, felt quite concerned that his socialist friends just didn't really seem to be willing to take the problem very seriously. He seems to have indeed developed a growing concern with their lack of interest in this. And by the time one gets to 1946, Popper no longer considered himself to be a socialist. But as he disclosed in a letter to Rudolf Carnap, which we were able to reprint in After the Open Society, a letter, I think, which is very well worth reading. Popper's reaction, while he was no longer a socialist, was in many ways quite a balanced, moderate, and nuanced one. That's to say, what had happened was that Popper and Carnap had resumed their correspondence after the Second World War, and Popper had mentioned Hayek to Carnap. Carnap was reacted very strongly against Hayek, and then said in passing to Popper, well, are you, Popper, still a socialist? Because he knew him as having been a socialist from Vienna. And Popper effectively said, well, no, I think just to talk about socialism is really rather naive, that it's wrong to think of socialization just as a panacea. But he still seemed willing to countenance the socialization of some industries if they couldn't be effectively, they were monopolies and couldn't effectively be controlled by other means, provided that this was seen as experimental and that the problems of actually undertaking this were realistically faced. What though were Popper's relations to Marxism? Popper is well known as a critic of Marxism, but this seems to have taken a while to develop in terms of the ideas concerning this for which he is best known. At one level, Popper seems to have been led quite early on to having misgivings about the idea that socialism or Marxism is scientific, and also about the idea that there is a telos or a goal to history. But it is, as things stand, I think rather difficult to judge just when Popper had what ideas. He tells us that while some of his ideas go back to 1919 or 1920, he had developed by 1935 the view that one couldn't predict the course of human history by rational means. But exactly what came when is difficult to judge. And in 1935 and 1936, he gave talks about the problems of the scientific or rational prediction of the course of human history. He gave talks in Brussels and also in a seminar that Hayek was running at the LSE. And these ideas fed into his poverty of historicism. But it's difficult to judge exactly what his ideas were, even at the point when he was giving those talks in Brussels and at the LSE. The poverty of historicism in manuscript form only exists in the form that he sent it in for Hayek to publish it in Economica. We just don't have, as far as I know, previous versions of the manuscript, but it's clear that he was doing a lot of work on it over time. In his Open Society, Popper also refers to his having had discussions with Karl Polanyi. These took place over the period 1924 to 1926, and they seem to have had some influence on Popper's ideas about the philosophy of social science. Polanyi seems to have influenced Popper to seeing Marx as stressing the unintended consequences of human social action, which then becomes decoupled from Marx's ideas about a teleology in history, a significant theme in Popper's work on the methodology of social science. And Polanyi, Popper indicates, also influenced him in his opposition to essentialism and as favoring what in the open society he calls a methodological nominalism in its place. And this is clearly related to the methodological individualism which Popper espouses and about which I'm going to be talking in a couple of lectures' time. What exactly Polanyi was advocating then is a bit difficult to judge, but he has commented that he was in some respects close to, I quote, the individualist method of the Austrian School of Economics, although he was at the time engaged in polemical discussions with them and on the other side from them about the problems of economic calculation under socialism. Polanyi himself favored a stress on the importance of non-economic ideals, as well as the kind of issues that Mises and then subsequently Hayek were emphasizing. Polanyi himself seems to have favored at that time a kind of guild socialism. Later, when he gave university extension lectures in London, he was a firm opponent on what seemed to me at the time then to have actually been religious grounds of the commodification of human labor. However, it's interesting that at that time, when he was giving these lectures in 1937 to 8, he contrasts what he calls British and continental ideas about democracy. His ideas concerning the latter in some ways resembling some of Popper's ideas in the open society. It's difficult, I think, to work out just what the relations between them were. They don't seem to have been in contact other than in the 1920s, and the ideas which seem to me in some ways not dissimilar to Popper's were things which were given as university extension lectures in London and haven't been published. I'll give in the notes a reference to where they can be located in the Polanyi archive. But at any rate, Polanyi is a sort of interesting, if slightly odd, given Popper's general trajectory, figure in his move away from Marxism and in his ideas about socialism. But what, though, were Popper's criticisms of Marxism? One can see the criticisms as operating at several different levels. First, there's his criticism of historicism. Here, Popper, in a way that was in line with the Marxism with which he was familiar and which has some support from Marx's work, but is probably not now the dominant view taken of Marx, took the view that Marxism involved strongly the idea that history has a teleological trajectory leading up to the realization of socialism, such that everything leads up to conditions which would allow, given the appropriate action being taken by the appropriate people, for socialism to be achieved. Once on this understanding of Marxism, this is understood, and once the benefits of socialism are understood, then only someone perverse would try to stand in its way. Popper became critical of the underlying view that history had any intrinsic underlying direction. He argued that such a view was simply not plausible, and that rather the direction that history and politics takes is in an important sense up to us. It's a matter for our decision. It's a matter for our moral responsibility. He also argued that there were formal problems about the idea that the future of human history was predictable. For example, because we couldn't predict future discoveries without obviously there becoming current ones, but he also saw the argument in his 1950 Determinism paper, which we've discussed earlier on, as giving, in a sense, a formal proof of the limits of prediction, even in circumstances where things might be fully determinate. Was Marx a historicist? It seems to me that there's room for argument about whether Marx actually held the views that Popper here criticized, although it should be said that the views that he was criticizing were widely held, and Popper was able to base his interpretations on Marx's writings. A problem here is that while Marx wrote a lot, indeed an enormous amount, he didn't write in a systematic manner. And at times he wrote almost unendingly about things where one would really have wished that he'd written rather less. And on a number of other key things, he was in danger of almost lining up with Jean-Jacques Rousseau as being employed in a factory that makes mottos to go into Christmas crackers. So things where you'd like to have them spelt out in a great deal of detail are often sort of truncated and really rather gnomic. All large-scale interpretations of his work, in consequence, involve a great deal of creative reconstruction and questions about how much weight is going to be given to some ideas and how much weight is going to be given to others. A former colleague of mine at the University of Manchester in the Department of Government there, Michael Evans, wrote in an interesting but underread book on Marx that it was more plausible to see him as suggesting that there were laws of historical development within particular forms of production rather than with regard to history as a whole. But this is very much a moot point. And so while what Popper is engaging with is certainly a view that people took and very reasonably took of Marx, it's not the only possible reading. Be that as it may, Engels and certainly many 20th century communists held Marxist views about history in much the form that Popper had engaged with them. It's interesting that in the journal Radical Philosophy, Robin Blackburn, who is well known as a Marxist New Left historian, wrote an obituary of Popper in which he suggested that Popper's critique of, I quote, the deterministic and positivistic Marxism of the Second International was welcomed and very much acceptable to the 1960s Marxist revolutionaries such as him. There is, though, a problem, for if one doesn't believe that there is a logic to history, or that leading up to socialism, or that all structural constraints on economic and political organization, which we labor under at the moment, will disappear once one moves into socialism, then on the face of it, Marxists should be as concerned as anyone else with recipes for the cook shops of the future. That's to say, if one disavows historical teleology, then how Marxists have actually behaved, I mean, in thinking in a sense that there isn't any problem about how socialism could possibly be organized, becomes rather difficult to understand. Popper suggests that there was a tension in Marx between what Popper refers to as pragmatist and historicist elements. The pragmatist ones Popper quite often illustrates by reference to Marx's theses on Feuerbach. Indeed, it's quite interesting that Sidney Hook, in his Towards the Understanding of Karl Marx. Sidney Hook was a well-known American pragmatist who, as a young man, was a die-hard and hardline Marxist, wrote this book Towards the Understanding of Karl Marx, and then later on became very well known as a critic of Marxism and of communism. But what he does in this book is offers a kind of pragmatist reinterpretation of Marx, but with reference also to Karl Korsch and to George Lukács. At any rate, this, the pragmatist strand of things, was, Popper argues, in tension with what he takes to be Marx's concern with historical prophecy. And Popper argues that Marx incorrectly equated a scientific approach with the assumption that determinism is correct, and then basically confused making conditional predictions with historical prophecies about the overall trajectory of society. Popper emphasized, too, the way in which this latter approach of Marx's meant that issues about social technology, issues about how to set about trying to resolve social problems, issues about what, if Marxists came to power, they should actually do, were set on one side as illegitimate or utopian, and that this left Marxist revolutionaries who came to power with a problem, that Marxism, in effect, offered them no suggestions at all as to what actually to do. Some other issues. Personally, I'd have thought that it's most plausible to see Marx's views as a theory of structural constraints on existing political action, together with a broad historical teleology leading up to socialism. In interpreting Marx, some people emphasize the technical, for example, Jerry Cohen. By contrast, one may alternatively emphasize the economic, the extraction of surplus value, and so on. Popper was critical of Marx, in part because of his early anti-essentialism, which leads him to be critical whenever he comes across it of structural elements to Marx's account. But in part because he, that's to say Popper, offered a detailed critique of the various aspects of Marx's views in the open society, one which strangely I don't think has ever been engaged with in detail by Marxists. I found the Marxist response to Popper's open society really rather disappointing on that score. Popper was indeed critical of what he called essentialism. Essentialism combined the idea that there are essences between each instance of a word. The ideas say that you could sensibly seek for the essence of the state as something lying behind each use of the term of the state. And it's interesting that Popper's criticism here has certain parallels with the ideas of the later Wittgenstein. There is actually a review of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations by Paul Feyerabend, who discusses commonalities between Popper and the later Wittgenstein on this. And it's actually quite interesting that Feyerabend, in fact, produced the first German translation of Popper's Open Society. But also when Popper was talking about essentialism, he was referring to the idea that we can obtain intuitive and certain knowledge of such essences, together with the idea that there is a hidden order behind the appearances in terms of which we can explain them, a view which he contrasted with explanation in terms of laws, which Popper favored. But all of these different elements to essentialism tended to be presented by Popper as if they were a kind of single package. In his criticism of Marx, Popper stressed the third of these themes. He took issue with that aspect of Marx. I think that Popper certainly highlights a feature of Marx's work by talking about that. That's to say, Marx had the idea that there is a reality behind appearances which we need to understand to truly grasp what is going on in social and political life, and also in understanding the history of ideas. But at least so it seems to me, there seems to be no reason why such a view has to be combined with any form of historicism. And indeed, given that Popper was willing enough to have his own scientific realism described as a modified essentialism, there seems to me no reason in principle why he should reject the structural stuff in Marxism. Although clearly, whether or not Marx was right in the specific claims that he made about these things is another matter. But I guess what I'm saying here is that it seems to me that Marx in the Open Society makes a big deal about what he thinks is bad in Marx, and a feature of this is essentialism, and I see no reason whatever why a fallibilist critical rationalist can't say there can be structures in the social world which are, as it were, the unintended consequences of human action, which then have a sort of thing-like character and which can then interact with us. I've argued this in my Political Thought of Karl Popper, and in fact, John Wetterston has argued before I produced this argument in a book that I didn't know at the time, a book of his called The Roots of Critical Rationalism. What about the scientific status of Marxism? This is a slightly complex business. As you'll recall from what I have said about the young Popper, he was led early on to think hard about the claims of Marxism to a scientific status and to contrast what Marxists were saying about Marxism and what proponents of psychoanalysis and of Adlerian psychology were saying about the status of that with how Popper understood the status of Einstein's work. Popper has sometimes presented his later views, that's to say his own later views about the philosophy of science, as flowing seamlessly from this. But these recollections don't really seem to be historically correct, in that in some of his psychological work, while he held a theory about the character of what constitutes science, he seems at that point to have been something of an inductivist. This is an argument that's been made amongst other people by Trels Eggers Hansen, and I will in the notes provide references to this. Popper's view about Marxism in the end was that it was refuted, but that how it was developed to deal with prima facie refutations then compromised its scientific character. The idea here is that there were problems. For example, that it certainly seems as if Marx had claimed that the poverty, or at least the relative poverty of the proletariat, of the working class, would increase over time. And it certainly looked as if Marx was committed to the view that a socialist revolution would take place not in Russia, and for goodness sake, certainly not in China, but in the most developed capitalist economies. To these problems, one might then see Lenin in terms, for example, of his theory of imperialism, and also others with ideas about uneven development of capitalism, as having offered an explanation in principle which could save the theory. So basically, what they were doing was developing the kind of possibility that Duhem had opened up and which Popper himself was in agreement with, namely that if you get a prima facie refutation, it is open to you to choose what element of your theoretical ideas you reckon is wrong and to modify that. But it's not clear that these ideas really work. For example, certainly many of the British colonies were at dead loss, and as I understand it, there's currently still ongoing debate amongst historians about whether the British Empire represented a source of wealth for Britain at all. Subsequently, as Marxism was developed in the Soviet Union, what was done by way of the interpretation of Marxism seemed to amount a little more than the offering of ad hoc theories in the worst sense to justify different changing policy decisions in Moscow. Clearly, though, it's open to a Marxist to claim that this latter stuff was just bad Marxism and to offer new content-increasing explanations of things as developments of Marxism as a research program. There has been interesting programmatic literature done by Marxists on the explanations of fascism. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's almost kind of variations on a theme that Marx developed when talking about the role of the peasantry in his small piece, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And one will find on the part of Marxist writers talking about fascism, different variations on this as a theme as to how one could understand the character of the state and its class character and so on at that point. And there's also literature on tensions between different factions within, or fractions rather, it should be, within capital. It is, however, an open question as to whether such explanations could be developed in ways that meet Popper's and Lakatos's requirements for the development of excess content. That's to say, there is a kind of programmatic challenge to these people to say, fine, you can have a go at this, but what you need to do from a critical rationalist perspective is to show that you can actually offer us content increasing explanations of what has taken place. One might, though, look possibly at some of the work of Alex Kalinikos, who is an intelligent guy. He's a revolutionary socialist, and he was actually at one point briefly a graduate student of Lakatos's, and so he's certainly familiar with critical rationalist ideas. Alternatively, Marxists might say, well, look, we don't see why we should comply with Popperian ideas about what constitutes scientific progress, and they need then to offer an alternative competing theory of science, and then to show that their ideas actually exemplified that. My impression, however, is that this kind of thing hasn't really been attempted, or at least not in a systematic way. I mean, there is a kind of almost unending succession of accounts by Marxists to explain at various points what's going on, but there hasn't been what, in my judgment, the critical rationalist would call for, namely a tracking of the development of the theories over time, an explanation of what went wrong at various points if things didn't work out, and then the offering of new explanations which can take account of those developments in a content increasing way. It seems to me personally that a detailed attempt to do this, and also to discuss Popper's detailed reconstruction and critique of Marx in the Open Society, would be something that would be really worthwhile. And I think that as far as I know, it's not really a challenge that Marxists have fully embraced. So far, I've stressed Popper's differences with Marx and with Marxism. I now want to talk about certain commonalities, certain common elements. At one level, there is clearly an emotional sympathy on Popper's part with Marxism. I mean, while he kind of revised this judgment later on in the light of his reading a hostile biography of Marx, there's a broad sympathy for Marx and for the situation of the working class as Marx depicts it. He was clearly moved by and sympathetic to Marx's critical account of capitalism as it was in his own day. Popper didn't go on and engage with the historical literature, which, for example, Hayek and some people associated with Hayek had produced, really claiming that the socialist history of this period had got things badly wrong. Popper's own view, I think, here in agreement with the revisionist socialist Bernstein, was that while Marx's criticism may have held good at the point that he was writing, it no longer held good, that with the development of society, what Marx had been talking about was no longer the case. At another level, as Popper indicated, his own treatment of Heraclitus and of Plato in the open society was clearly in some ways influenced by Marx's work. For a significant aspect of Popper's criticism, say of Plato, is what might be called his highlighting of the politically regressive features of Heraclitus's and Plato's views. Just as an aside, a kind of oddity about Popper's approach here. What in a way is, I think, strange is that Popper offers this kind of critique rather than concentrating on a critique of the epistemological ideas which in Plato serve to legitimate the rule of the guardians. Popper can certainly point to the significance of the fallibility of our knowledge and to the idea that societies would benefit from critical feedback from everyone to those who are taking key decisions. But an appeal, sympathy for ordinary people is fair enough. But I think an appeal to the judgment of ordinary people as such doesn't seem to me to be quite as telling as Popper thinks that it is, in a setting, if he's talking about Plato, in which democracy seems to have been rather like contemporary populism. The people who were advocates of democracy then and of its products might indeed have been the people who liked a certain recent president of the United States. And where Popper himself seems to me not really to face the problem of how to give social authority to the best of our fallible knowledge. That's to say, there's a kind of thrust in Popper about fallibility, about a kind of the fallibility of experts and so on, which is all perfectly true. But it seems to me, and personally, I think it's a major issue facing us today, that we really lack now mechanisms through which, on the one side, the knowledge that is guiding policy decisions can be criticized, but also when whatever best survives such criticism is accorded a certain kind of social authority. That seems to be typically now, by contrast with this, a dismissal of expert views completely, and the idea that everyone is entitled to their own judgment. Well, they can clearly make their own judgment, but whether it's right or not is quite a different matter. As I mentioned in an earlier lecture, Popper was involved in the German translation of Lenin's Materialism and Empirio-criticism. This was a passionate critique by Lenin of Russian Marxists who'd reworked Marx's ideas on the basis of the ideas of Ernst Mach. Lenin was critical in part because Marx's views, rather than being a neutral monism, as Marx represented them as being, were, he argued, in fact, best understood as a form of subjective idealism. And in part, he was critical of the way in which this kind of view seemed to deny the reality of the world and the reality of human suffering. There's also some sympathy with this kind of view in Popper's Objective Knowledge, Chapter 2. Next, Popper's anti-psychologism. In his Open Society, Popper developed certain ideas about the methodology of the social sciences, in which he links to those of Marx. They are a critique of the idea that we should expect to explain social phenomena in psychological terms. Popper's argument here is that while phenomena may be seen as the products of individual action, those actions have to be understood as socially situated, and thus as having a social content which can't be explained in purely psychological terms. That's to say, our motives, our situation, the institutions in terms of which we're operating are all social, and one might say, in a sense, historical, and can't be eliminated from our explanations, while the attempt to find psychological origins for such things seems to Popper to lead us into kind of futile just-so stories. Not least, as Popper argues, humans were surely social before they were fully human. And so the notion of kind of trying to see society as a result of asocial individuals who make some sort of contract seems to Popper just to be idiotic. At the same time, Popper is perfectly happy that if we take the point about the socially situated character of people's actions, it's fine if we find them useful to make use of psychological theories. What we should make of the resulting methodological ideas, however, seems to me less than clear-cut, as Popper doesn't really discuss examples of the kind of social theory of which he's critical. He is clearly at odds with approaches which seek to explain social phenomena just in terms of people's psychological dispositions. But it's not clear if he's taking issue with rational choice style explanations in terms of people's preferences, as one finds them in microeconomics. Indeed, as I'll discuss when I talk about Popper's philosophy of social science in a later lecture, it's not clear if the thrust of the methodological individualism that Popper favors leads us to Weberian-style explanations in terms of the unintended consequences of meaningful action, or to something closer to rational choice, although in Open Society, Chapter 14, there's material in his discussion of what he calls an institutionalist approach, which might seem to tell against his latter option. But it seems to me that Popper is a champion of methodological individualism. But if you ask, well, exactly how is he suggesting that people should proceed in the social sciences? This doesn't seem to me to be completely straightforward. What I think one doesn't get in Popper, not least because it might seem to be ruled out by an aspect of his anti-essentialism, which I've criticized, although one might try to see it, the Open Society Chapter 14 as being something from which something similar to what I'm suggesting could be extracted, is the idea not just that meaningful human actions have unintended consequences, but that these things may then confront us as thing-like constraints upon our actions. That's to say, if one ditches Marx's historical teleology, what he says about the relations of production and related phenomena seem to me to be something very useful, and for which Popper's approach to politics and the philosophy of social science would, I think, have benefited. I'll say a bit more about this in later lectures, but just to give you a taster for this, Popper is reported by Peter Muntz as having discussed with Peter Muntz Hayek's Road to Serfdom. But he seems not to have liked very much the kind of systematic aspects to that and wanted to have emphasized instead piecemeal social engineering. But social engineering, it seems to me, really has to be undertaken in the light of our theoretical knowledge of what the constraints are that we're facing, rather than just being something that should operate by trial and error. I now want to say something about what Popper says against Robinson Crusoe as a scientist, and to suggest, but then to dismiss as a red herring, the idea that this may be a further fragment of Marxist influence. An interesting theme is Popper's criticism in his Open Society of the view that science could be successfully undertaken by Robinson Crusoe, a figure, say, who had been brought up from his youth by animals. I mean, Crusoe is obviously different because he was socialized before he got to his desert island. But imagine a Crusoe-like figure who had been nurtured by wolves or bears or meerkats or whatever else you like. Popper's argument here has parallels with Marx's criticism of what he calls the Robinsonades of classical economics. Popper's view is that objectivity in science has to be understood as a product of intersubjective activity, such that even if Crusoe came up with the content of science on his own, we should see it more as we would the product of a soothsayer or someone reading it out of a crystal ball than as being real science, because for Popper, science depends crucially on intersubjective criticism and appraisal. However, while the Marx theme here is suggestive, and I at one point thought that here was another interesting parallel with Marx, it turns out to be a red herring. I apologize for the joke. For while there are indeed certain parallels, the more obvious ones are to Marx's criticisms of Robinsonades in his Grundrisse, which wasn't available at the time when Popper wrote. While as Trailsegger's Hansen has set out in a paper which isn't yet published, it seems as if the more obvious source for this theme in Popper's work is something that occurs in the work of his teacher, Karl Bühler. However, indeed, what might lie behind Bühler's idea, and indeed Marx's talking about Robinsonade, I simply don't know. And so all I can suggest here is that there is an approximate influence on Popper, which seemed more likely than anything from Marx. I don't know if there was some influence behind that, that's to say, behind what's to be found in Bühler, or indeed if there's a prehistory of the Robinsonade stuff before Marx. Next, the empirical basis. As I've suggested, one might even look at Popper's theory, the empirical basis, as in some ways exemplifying a Marxist approach. Certainly it is in terms of a social approach which stresses into subjectivity to be found in some strands of Marxist thought. It's also well known in Habermas, although it actually seems to me that the intersubjectivity in Habermas comes from the same source as the intersubjectivity in Popper, namely a particular theme in Kant. However, Celia Benhabib suggested that this approach in Habermas stems from Hegel. She argues this in her early book, Critique, Norm and Utopia. Her argument here, however, seems to me to be a bit implausible, just because while she finds some evidence for intersubjectivity selectively in Hegel, I'd have thought that there are other themes in Hegel which amount to a good bit more than intersubjectivity. The stuff about intersubjectivity in Popper, for example, in his discussion of the empirical basis, is explicitly acknowledged to come from something in Kant. Well, if one wants to look for a first here, before Kant, Adam Smith's account of morality in his theory of moral sentiment seems to me to be interestingly intersubjective in its character. Finally, it's worth mentioning that at the end of a very nice textbook on the philosophy of science by Alan Chalmers called What is This Thing Called Science? In the first edition, there is some discussion of the French Marxist Louis Althusser. And at the time in Australia amongst Marxists, there was an interest in his work and in its relations to Popper concerning what Popper wrote about methodological rules. And it led on the part of some people to an anti-psychologistic view of science as a form of what they referred to as theoretical practice. One exemplification of this was in a piece written by two Sydney Marxists, Curtois and Sachting, who had a go at Paul Feyerabend from such a perspective in a piece that was published in the Norwegian English language journal Inquiry in 1977. Feyerabend then replied to them in his usual scathing way in Science in a Free Society. So if you want to have a look to see what this is all about, work back from that, and then you can see also the material in What is This Thing Called Science. I think that there was actually something of interest in this approach, but this particular controversy seems to have been about the end of it. Although I've myself argued for a partly social interpretation of methodological rules. But I'll spare you this until, if there is one, series 2 of these lectures. Thank you all very much, and let's move over now to some critical discussion. You need to flag electronically if you want to come in on the discussion. Philip, I suspect, will have a lot to say by way of objections, because this is an area in which he's got some expertise. I don't see any hand yet. John has indicated that he's got a hand up. John.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Yeah, I'm writing very much about the things you're talking about as we speak in my thesis. I feel I could actually, for the first time, actually answer a question that you asked. Namely, because I wrote about it also in that piece that I just sent you about comparing Mises and Popper. Yeah,
this is for the Popper conference coming along in a couple of weeks' time.
Exactly. Yeah, because you asked something about rational choice theory, and so in my reading, I think Popper's conception of the rationality principle is decidedly different than that of Mises, and he even says that it's explicitly an objectivist point of view, objective point of view of rationality rather than a subjective point of view. And it's a different interpretation of methodological, or application, shall we say, of methodological individualism, I think, than Mises. And to me, Hayek, as I wrote in there, is kind of between Mises and Popper. But,
yeah, look, I'd agree completely, and I'm going to talk about that in the lecture that I'm giving in a couple of weeks' time on Popper and the methodology of social science.
I look very much forward to it.
Well, I don't know if you'll well, you're looking forward to it may well change when the reality of it is disclosed to you. But the odd thing was that I just by chance came across the fact that while Karl Polanyi was engaged critically against Mises in the argument about socialist calculation, he seems to have described himself as actually following an Austrian type of individualist approach, so that his disagreement was about other things. And if that's the case, there may have been an indirect influence on Popper right in the 1920s. But it's really only later that he, in effect, accepts Hayek's account of methodology as being what people are doing in microeconomics, but then offers his own reinterpretation of it. But thanks very much. I mean, I think that's interesting stuff there.
Just one word to mention to anybody, the key piece by Popper, I think, is Models, Instruments, and Truth. In The Myth of the Framework is where he talks about this. So just quite an interesting piece on social science methodology.
Thanks.
Okay.
Anyone else? Hassan.
I'm wondering, I don't know if this is a question with a concrete answer, or it's just a sort of tension that I see sometimes, that while Popper, when he discusses, for example, metaphysics or some philosophical ideas regarding, for example, mind-body problem and stuff, he opposes the positivist approach that only scientific ideas are worth discussing and other things, non-scientific things, should be discarded. And he thinks that all of them can be considered as research programs, and if we approach them critically, all of them are worth discussion and contemplation. And this is completely reasonable from a point of a critical rationalist philosopher. But why, when he comes to these, specifically these three ideas that always he says, my philosophy of science, in fact, started by contemplating on the difference between Freud's ideas and Adler's and Marxist as compared with Einstein. And then he talks about those three as non-scientific and Einstein as scientific. Why in this specific point he is so sensitive about being scientific and non-scientific? Was there any claim in those that had some bad consequences that he tried to prevent that?
No, the situation really is that it was only essentially during the 1950s that he seems to have developed an account of how one could critically appraise non-scientific theories. So in his early writings, up until and including The Open Society and the Poverty of Historicism, all the work is really done by arguments about science and methodology. And while in fact, I think the best way of understanding his what he's actually trying to argue in The Poverty of Historicism is that he is advancing an argument that it is a poor research program. He can't really describe it like that, because he didn't at that point, if he was challenged, have a theory about quite what he was up to. And if I say if he was challenged, he would have been challenged just because he was acutely aware that colleagues and friends of his in the Vienna circle used to kind of howl down as meaningless anything that was metaphysical. And so Popper was in this respect on the defensive. It is, I'm just trying to think where it comes. I mean, it may be somewhere in his autobiography or in The Self and Its Brain that he does there later on say, well, you know, there are elements of Freud's approach which are in effect an interesting research program, but I think that he was particularly sensitive because he had felt that he'd sort of swallowed the claims of Marxism to be science, and that he'd been helping the people organizing this demonstration, and that people had died as a result. And so it was a kind of crisis of confidence in himself, and he just felt really terrible about it. And I mean, he was in his mid-teens when people tend to feel things like that very, very strongly, rather than just saying, oh dear, I was mistaken. But that I think is the explanation for that. Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I've now got Luke, Peter, Thomas, and John again, unless it's an old dead hand.
I just wanted to respond.
No, I wasn't calling on you. I was just saying you're fourth in the queue.
No, I'm just saying it's about Hassan's question, but whenever it's okay, yeah?
Yes, no, fine, if it's on Hassan's question.
Oh, okay. So just very briefly, I think looking at this, I think Popper sees Freudian psychoanalysis and Marxism of his time as pseudosciences, but he doesn't see pseudoscience as nonsense, just like he doesn't see metaphysics as nonsense, because if you discuss it critically, it could lead to theories that could then be falsifiable or not. So, I mean, for example, Freud's idea of the superego and the id, etc., could then later on actually materialize in cognitive science, where actual centers of the brain are identified. For example, the cerebral cortex is where what Freud called the superego would be located. Yeah, so it's. But he also talks about the pre-Socratics as coming up with myths that are basically theories. So it's like it's sort of a pre-theory, but it's not a science because it's not falsifiable.
Yeah, but you see, as I was trying to say, what happens is that you then get him later developing a theory of metaphysical research programs where such theories can be put forward, and even though they're not testable, they can still nonetheless be appraised. But it's just that the pseudoscience stuff is, I mean, he had, as it were, limited critical tools available to him when he was making that early engagement.
I'm just saying, he may have thought that somewhere down the line, these things could become testable.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, exactly. My question was about Popper's different angles or different responses, somehow defending metaphysics and somehow attacking, for example, Freud's psychoanalysis.
Yes, but go back to the earlier lectures on this, because I went through all of this stuff, including quoting Popper in Objective Knowledge, saying that his views about these things had changed. So, I mean, I tried to give a run-up to this stuff. I'll look for references and will mention to you again where that stuff's to be found in the notes. Okay, now we had, I think it was Thomas next, then did I say Peter and then Luke? Thomas.
Thank you. I think Luke was coming after me, but something you should decide. I have a question about the claim that Popper was a Marxist. I mean, he makes this claim, and I think you've mentioned it in more than one lectures. And I'm wondering, what does it mean to be a Marxist? Because he was young Popper and he was in his teens and he was working for the Communist Party, but not as, I don't know, a proper party member, but he was an errand boy. And I think that's everything that can be accountable for calling Popper a Marxist. And do I miss anything, or is there another dimension of Popper being a Marxist?
Well, he's told us that he was a Marxist and then had a kind of crisis of faith in the claims of Marxism after the death of these people. And he is documented specifically as having chosen to work as a volunteer in the headquarters of the then tiny Communist Party. So, I mean, it wasn't, I mean, the story was, I think briefly as I gave it, that Popper as a youngster was very intellectually precocious. I mean, he was discussing scientific ideas and so on. Someone who was talking with him about these things had warned him off Marxism. Nonetheless, he became attracted to it to the point where he actually went and worked as a volunteer and then had this crisis of faith. So that's the story. I mean, I don't know. I mean, obviously he was a youngster. It seems to have loomed large in his own intellectual and emotional life story. And he clearly shows a certain continuing sympathy for Marx's perspective. And as I've mentioned, and he said himself, that his treatment of Plato is bearing the mark of a Marxist perspective. And indeed, I mean, you may well know much more than I do about this. It's my understanding that Popper was, for a long time, associated with social democratic organizations in Austria, and within them, Marxist ideas were significantly influential. So, I mean, one would have to go back and try, I mean, I just don't know what there is. It is possible that there may be some evidence in the sense that Bill Bartley, when he was doing work for Popper's, for the biography he was writing of Popper, did various interviews. And it was thought, I think, that all of that material had been lost. It is now not clear that all of that stuff is lost. And so it is just possible that there might be some evidence when that comes to light. I understand that Bartley's papers are eventually going to go to the Hoover. And if they go to the Hoover, it might be possible for the Popper Library to see whether copies of this stuff, or at least the stuff that relates to his work on Popper, might be made available. But I only know of the fact that a lot of material has been located, and apparently that it's going to the Hoover, although with the lockdowns and so on, heaven knows how long that's going to last.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I agree. Nevertheless, I'm somehow not satisfied with saying Popper volunteered for the Communist Party and then worked as an errand boy as an explanation what being a Marxist means for him.
Well,
I mean,
no,
I completely agree to everything else and his intellectual engagement, but from a biographical point of view, this is somehow, maybe it blew up in his representation of his youth.
I think that there are two aspects to it. I mean, clearly, he identified with what these people were doing at the time, and he seems to have had a direct personal involvement with them, although obviously only in the kind of way in which someone who was a youngster, a willing youngster who said that he agreed with the ideas, could have had in that setting. I mean, he wasn't a Communist Party member, and he certainly wasn't himself, you know, an official of the Communist Party, but he clearly knew from working with them in the headquarters what was going on. Okay, I've got, I think, Peter now, then Luke. Peter, you have to unmute.
Okay, hi. Now, Marx, I think, can be criticized for his historicism, but also for a crucial economic mistake, that of ignoring the monopoly land ownership as a competing factor of production, as discussed in the work of his contemporary Henry George. And I was wondering if Popper, or for that matter even Hayek, was familiar with the work of Henry George and his ideas of, say, the single tax on land value.
I don't know of any interest in on Popper's part in this, but what I would say is that Popper really had, as far as I know, relatively limited knowledge of economics. And what I would say is, I mean, he was involved with Karl Polanyi at a time when Polanyi was discussing issues to do with economic calculation. He refers to Bohm-Bawerk's ideas in Die beiden Grundprobleme. He expresses in his Open Society some kind of admiration for theoretical economics, but I don't know how much he knew about it, other than from having read some of Hayek. And then there was also a guy in, an economist in New Zealand, who he became friendly with and who he discussed his ideas in the poverty of historicism with, and whose name escapes me, but who's actually written a book with some of his reminiscences on Popper. In broad terms, I mean, people sometimes associate Popper and Hayek, but the key difference between them was that Popper wasn't an economist. He did work in psychology, and then he became interested in issues in physics and probability and so on. I think he just didn't have the kind of broad knowledge in economics which would have brought him into contact with the Henry George material. So that, I think, is the answer there.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, I've got now Luke.
Yeah, I think Popper was so busy with all kinds of stuff that was too much for him. I think so. So what I want to say is, because you were talking about piecemeal social change, and a bit negative, because I think, of course, Popper said that these changes could be large scale on condition that you knew what you were doing. You shouldn't experiment with people. But what I want to say is, if you have large scale phenomena like history or economics, you can discuss these things from all points of view, and there is so much material. Like, for instance, if you see Cuba, some people who are against communism will say, oh, you see, they're poor. It doesn't work. But if you ask a Cuban, they will say, well, of course it doesn't work. It's because of the sanctions of the Americans. So you can always interpret all the data in different ways, and there's no way to get out of it. It's only if you do things on a scale that you can see that there is some result that you can trust.
Yeah.
That you can do anything, because this way. And he wrote about history, that you can, yeah, you have a point of view, and there is so much material, you can always find something that supports your view. It's not conclusive.
But there's several issues. I mean, one is, as I suggested with regard to the imperialism and the different fractions of capital stuff, there is obviously the possibility of suggesting that one can answer a particular problem. It's a question, and that's perfectly legitimate. It's a question of whether it really does resolve the problem, and also whether what the ideas that you're putting up are independently testable. And so what I was trying to suggest was that in Popper's later thought about these things, you have got an approach which suggests how Marxism as a research program and how attempted scientific explanations within it and how modifications to them could all be appraised. But it's then just a matter of seeing in detail whether it works, or if people object to that, of their having to come up with a different philosophy of science and argue for that. My point before about piecemeal social engineering was rather different. I mean, this can be large scale, Popper says. And the crucial thing for Popper is that if it runs into problems, we should be able to learn from it rather than it's just being too big. What I was suggesting as a problem for Popper was the notion that I don't think that he gives sufficient weight to the possibility that there may be constraints on our actions which we can understand theoretically and which we should then be bearing in mind when considering if we should engage in certain kinds of piecemeal social engineering. Let me give you an example. I'm not saying that it's correct, but the key thing is it legitimate to have theories operating in this area? Popper basically has said, well, he very much liked New Zealand, and he's really attracted to the idea of life in an egalitarian society, but he's come to the conclusion that there's an incompatibility between this and people's freedom. There is another different kind of argument which someone could make with reference to Hayek, where Hayek has argued, look, there is a big problem facing us in an economy of the kind that we have, namely that there doesn't really seem to be any option but for us to make use of markets in terms of coordinating our actions with those of other people, and within which learning by trial and error and so on can take place. But Hayek argues that effectively means that there will always be various kinds of inequalities, just on the grounds that if someone comes up with an idea such as Facebook, which proves popular, they do well and make a lot of money out of it. If I have ideas and I put money into them and I lose my money, then I am going to be really very badly off. The crucial thing here is really going to be, does Popper give sufficient weight in his arguments to the possibility that there may be structural constraints on our actions which come about as unintended consequences of the actions that people are performing in various social situations, but which then give the economy or other aspects of society a kind of thing like character, which then constrains what we can do. I mean, you might say, well, you can obviously then try and change those constraints, but then you're likely to get to new ones. I'm not saying the particular thing to which I'm referring is correct. It seems to me that Popper himself, in his dismissal of all aspects of essentialism, unnecessarily throws out that kind of possibility.
But he wrote about unintended consequences, and that's not.
I'm sorry?
He wrote about unintended consequences, eh?
Yes. But this is different because his picture is typically that we try things out, find they have unintended consequences, and then set about remedying those. Whereas what I'm suggesting is that our theoretical knowledge of what the systematic unintended consequences of doing things are may tell us, for example, that, well, under these conditions, going for something which sort of everybody agrees would be nice may actually not make any sense, and that if we attempted it even, it would produce disasters. And so my argument is, Popper, I think, misses out on accepting the good bits of essentialism, and thus the possibility that our what we attempt to do by way of piecemeal social engineering should be constrained by our knowledge of what social constraints there are.
I have to think about this.
Yeah, well, that's fine. I'm not saying I'm right. That's just the line of argument that I was offering.
Now, I'm very curious to hear Philip. Okay.
Okay, I have Philip next. Then could I just say, things are coming up on chat. I'm not sure if everyone can see them, and it's probably best if you come in and put them as a hand rather than just try and contribute them in chat. Okay, Philip.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Luke, for saying you're wondering what I was going to say. I'm also wondering. Can I refer back to Thomas's point, because I think that's a very interesting question. Was Popper really ever a Marxist? And his association with the Communist Party was brief and was at a time when, at 16 or 17 years of age, he could be excused for not having the greatest of theoretical engagement with Marxism. And I think he was caught up in the first remarkable enthusiasm for Leninism, which was not just among 17-year-olds in Austria, but indeed globally. All of a sudden, this person who almost no one had heard of, including very few Marxists had heard of, suddenly became the star of the moment, the celebrity act, and everyone jumbled to the cause and assumed that the Bolshevik way was the way forward. I think he can be excused for a certain amount of immature engagement at that point. He does, however, claim to have been associated with a number of Marxists and to have been part of a movement which I think you can characterize in the 1920s and 1930s as a form of revisionist Marxism, or in some respects a rejection of the core tenets of Marxism, but an attempt to recalibrate and to reposition so that supposedly the socialist movement can move forward. And you are quite right in identifying, I think, when I say quite right, I agree with you, in other words, Jeremy, that's about as right as I can say, that it's associated with the work of Edward Bernstein and his Austrian followers, with the Braunthal brothers in Austria in particular, with some others who are in the leadership of the Austrian Social Democratic Party. So I think there is an association with that kind of Marxism, but it's always a Marxism filtered by local enthusiasm, by fashion, which is never very reliable, and by the chance of social associations with, for example, the Braunthal brothers in particular seem to have been very influential. What Popper never engages with is what I would actually think to be the central concern of Marx, which is to overcome the relationship between wage labor and capital. I mean, he never seems to see that what Marx was concerned about when he describes, quote, capitalism, unquote, whatever the hell that is, as a system based on wage labor. I mean, there's no engagement ever. I mean, the closest he comes to is where he makes a side reference to Engels and a few others referring to capitalism as wage slavery. That's as close as he gets to the idea that wage labor is the foundation, as Marx understood it, of capitalism. So there is a, I think Thomas's point hits home directly, and ought not to be assumed to be a trivial point. He had a very peculiar view of Marxism to begin with, which was of course a popular peculiar view, but not necessarily one that is typical of, let's say, earlier generations of Marxism, nor even of what Marx's theoretical contribution was. Second point, many of the problems with Marxism can actually be resolved and strengthened or overcome by Popper. It strikes me that if a Marxist wishes to rehabilitate Marxism and move beyond the dead end of historicism and the essentialist or Platonic contaminations of Marxism, look to what Popper later wrote, both in terms of his fallibilist approach, his understanding of science, but also the development of this what Margarita calls the free world hypothesis, that it seems to me is a far better overcoming of the deficiencies in materialism that Marx himself addressed in the thesis on Feuerbach. When you look at the thesis on Feuerbach, you look at that particular engagement, Marx says, you know, essentially materialism as it has been developed up until this point is deficient. It is unable to effectively deal with ideas or to understand sensuous, self-changing human being. There is a deficiency that Marx notices. He ultimately kind of brushes it over by claiming to come up with a new form of materialism, sensuous materialism. But it seems to me that Popper revisits that same issue in Objective Knowledge in his writings that you had from the mid-60s. I think it is refreshing and interesting. Coming back very briefly to a couple of other points, if I may, Jeremy, because I know there's several other people waiting, so I want to do this very quickly. There are some other curious features about Popper's engagement with this concept of historicism, which is, in some respects, a real I mean, on one hand, it's a very interesting concept in and of itself, the way he develops it, but it has proven to be of enormous difficulty in actually communicating with the left and getting beyond the initial stumbling over Popper's reception, I think, by some elements of the left. There is a sense in which Popper himself ultimately comes round, if not to a telos, then at least to a directionality in history. I mean, you look at the work again at the end of the 1960s, you look at the very opening of his 1967 essay at Oxford on the philosophy of history, a pluralist philosophy of history. He says that there is indeed a sense of direction. There is a sense in which we move towards an ever-increasing growth of knowledge. In a sense, Popper reinvents the aim of history or a directionality of history after having exercised the ghost of historicism. Peter Muntz, who you mentioned in passing, Peter Muntz suggests that Popper was essentially attacking a straw man, a person of his own creation when he attacked historicism. I think that's an interesting observation to perhaps reflect a little further on. One other couple of things that came up. You mentioned Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe actually features in Volume 1 of Capital. It's not something that had to await the publication of or republication of the Grundrisse. Indeed, the Grundrisse is in a sense the notes that Marx used for writing Capital. And Volume 1 of Capital includes the example of how you have human beings always situated in social relationships. There is something that goes all the way back to the thesis on Feuerbach. In fact, you don't have a human essence existing outside of time or in isolation from other parts of society. What gives us our humanity is always defined socially, or is always refined, I should say, socially. There's a dialectical or interactive component invariably in that. And finally, I suppose I would have to point to similarities between Marx's conception of praxis, or if you will, of criticism of ideas through practice, and some of what Popper himself was later to develop. But I've tried to touch on a couple of bits and pieces. There are many others, but I think other people are waiting, so I better give you a chance to respond to me and tell me where I'm wrong, and then hear the other views.
Okay, a quick response. First of all, look, it seems to me that Popper obviously was traumatized by his engagement with the Communist Party. He then, in the Open Society, seems to me to be, in a sense, his writing up of critical reflections on Marxism as a whole. Some of those critical reflections are things which Bernstein and others would have shared, but I think that he certainly did his best to offer a reconstruction of Marxism as it was widely understood politically at that time. And indeed, one finds, I mean, there was the reference that I made in the Robin Blackburn stuff to the Second International, and one finds just generally that kind of what Popper is taking issue with is very close to the official Russian view of historical materialism. So, I mean, it's really something which, I mean, I don't know what Popper was involved with when he was young, although clearly he thought that something that he had staked a lot on emotionally was science, and came to the conclusion that it wasn't. And then over time, he came to the considered engagement with Marxism that you talked about. The problems overcomable in Marxism, overcomable by Popper, well, you could say that in some ways, many of the things that Popper was critical of have been ditched by so-called analytical Marxists. So, I mean, Roemer, Cohen, and other such writers. So, I mean, you could certainly offer a reconstruction of that, although I would want to say, but I think that Popper's dismissal of the aspect of essentialism that I've been talking about was actually a bad mistake. Historicism, the key thing there, I would have thought, is that what he's taking issue with is the Marxian reinterpretation of the Hegelian notion of the cunning of history, which in turn is Hegel's own version of, own reinterpretation of Christian ideas about God's providence running through history. And I think that the respect in which Popper is explicitly critical is with the idea of there being an underlying direction to history, which in a certain sense is working its way out through the instrumentality of human concerns and passions and so on. And so the problem, well, I mean, in that context, I think Popper is at odds with something that's very real and something that is certainly taken over by the older Frankfurt school, and some of the people whose work they've influenced. I mean, there's this notion, as it were, of socialism being something which is kind of implicit in the way in which things are going. And I take that to be very different from notions about knowledge when that is a conscious aspiration of people. Next, I just don't agree with Muntz that it's a straw man. I mean, I can document lots of people who, not just in the Soviet Marxist tradition, but lots of later Marxists who have it. The Robinsonian thing, Crusoe is certainly there in Capital. I was talking at that point of specifically the Robinsonade notion, which when I did a search on this, I was getting hits on that specifically for the Grundrisse. And where the thing is that in Popper, this stuff comes up in the context of people being able to discover their own personal, being unable to discover their own personal bias. And it's in this context that Hansen has argued that these specific things in Popper and are very close to what is in Bühler, and that there are parallels here between the discussion in the Open Society and in Die beiden Grundprobleme and that other material. I mean, I myself had suggested that this was a kind of Marxist echo or residue in Popper, and so all I'd say is I mean, the more one can make for such a case is I'd be happy with. The paper of Hansen's to which I've referred is actually a joint thing, in the first part of which I float this idea, documenting it with regard to Marx, and then say, but alas, it actually looks as if Hansen is right and the other stuff is there. And praxis, I don't know. I mean, I think that the relationship between praxis and teleology in Marx seems to me to be one which it's quite difficult to sort out. And where particularly, you see, if you ditch the teleology, then it immediately becomes important to say, well, how is society going to work? And if you don't think that everything is given to socialism by the internal logic of the development of capitalism, so that there will be, as it were, a sufficient concentration of industry that the planning functions that are being run by the few top capitalists can simply be taken over. I mean, once that is ditched, you're actually into recipes for the cook shops of the future along with everybody else.
So Jeremy, can I just very briefly come back on one of those two? So first of all, the praxis thing, I think what you do if you take telos away from praxis, the answer is you have people stumbling around in caves. And that, I think, is something that actually you do have in the early Marx, the Marx that Popper described as a humanist activist, a form of Marxism, not a determinist or necessarily overly Hegelian, even though it was closer in terms of the time when he was, so to speak, a paid-up member of the Hegelian club. But so that's number one. That you have this not necessarily directed, but other than perhaps a groping your way towards the light and a better way of keeping upright while you're stumbling in the cave. So that's what praxis is without telos, and I think that is very much conjecture and consistent with the conjecture and refutation approach. You try certain things, you try and feel your way forward, and you hope that you don't stumble too badly as you move. So that's number one. The other question I wanted to come back to Hassan's earlier observation about Marx and scientificity as one of the starting points for Popper's suggestion, it strikes me that what Popper was making, and I think a very correct decision, was to reject violence in that context, at least, as immoral, as you are repelled by the manipulation of people towards violence. But Popper himself later endorses violence in other contexts, not least when he goes to New Zealand. He is an active supporter of the victory of the Allies in the Second World War. I mean, there is a sense in which you make moral judgments, and there is not a resort there necessarily to a scientific claim as to why the Second World War must be won by the Allies, but there is certainly a moral decision where violence in certain contexts is endorsed by Popper. But it seems to me that he's kind of conflating, in the moment of 1919, he's conflating a moral repulsion of the way people were manipulated in that violent act with the wider issues and possible claims. And so those are two very key points I wanted to make. The other point that I wanted to reference, you say, there is some passing resemblance with Bernstein. Jeremy, I think that's a massive understatement. Bernstein is almost written out of the notes of Popper, by the way. There's only one inaccurate reference to Bernstein in the entirety of The Open Society and Its Enemies. And yet you look at the chapter in The Open Society and Its Enemies, where Popper describes the flaws in Marxian analysis of economics. It reads almost word for, not word for word, but it very closely resembles Bernstein's argument. I mean, this is more than just a coincidence. There is a deep borrowing from that well of ideas.
Well, I'm not. The violence thing is complicated because, I mean, Popper from time to time writes as if he's a kind of pacifist, and he isn't. And I think there is a big issue there, although I think with regard to Marxism, the issue is going to be how much weight is being carried by theoretical claims. The Bernstein stuff, I mean, he has the one reference in there.
Inaccurate, please note. A
okay.
Bernstein rather than E. Bernstein.
Yeah. But I mean, I was just, I mean, my recollection was that I just simply referred to that. I mean, I made no judgment about where Popper developed his criticisms from, and there is obviously commonality there. Okay, thanks very much. Ali Reza, I have next. You're muted.
Hi, thanks for your talk and discussion. I don't know I'm not sure whether my interpretation is how correct or not. My question, by the way, is that why is Popper so critical of telos in Hegel's and Marx's philosophy of history, but he is not so sensitive in the teleological element of Kant's philosophy of history?
I would just say, I think, I would agree. I think that the in Kant, there is a similar kind of problem, and also in my judgment, though I'm no expert on this, it runs quite deep in Kant in terms of he appeals to other ideas of a teleological character in different parts of his work. I mean, I guess all I would say is that the only stuff that seems to be significant in terms of an influence on Popper are aspects of his epistemology and ethics. But I think that you're dead right. I mean, I think that Kant's ideas about history are very similar to what he was objecting to there.
Thanks.
Thanks. Now, Margareta.
Yes, my video, I will make it work in a minute. Yeah.
Well, it's fine. I mean, a disembodied,
yeah.
no, okay.
A couple, very quickly for people who didn't read it in the chat. So 3 world hypotheses I got from this article by Brian Boyd that discusses the 3 world hypotheses in great detail, and it seems to be the most comprehensive definition. Now, my question reflects a little bit what, sorry, I'm looking at the name again. What was mentioned in the footnotes about whether or not Popper supports methodological essentialism in the social sciences. And here I would like to bring up something that I haven't heard in the discussion, and that I personally got drawn to by Popper. And that is, when you say logic, it means distinction. And for Popper, he says we make ad hoc distinctions. But there's also a view in the world that says, no, there is a distinction and it's indubitable. No one can disagree with it. And so in Vienna, when Popper grew up, there was an abandonment of the distinction that there was blue blood. I don't know how else to say it. So that there was royalty. And the royalty by their genes or their blood by default were superior. And so there was no discussion necessary because the distinction was there and you just have to accept it. And that has been discussed by Arthur Lovejoy in his book The Great Chain of Being, how there has been always this meme in history to think that there are a fixed set of distinctions that are indubitably true, no discussion is necessary. And that I'm kind of reading Popper, that he picked up on that type of reasoning, and that he is actually arguing against that, and that is the great contribution that he makes to socialism, so to say, but also that is what differentiates him from Mises and Hayek. Like that Mises, the way I read him, he and by the way, that's also in Schumpeter's view of economics, that he thinks as entrepreneurs as superior human beings with no questions asked, and that is the reason we don't need a state, because there are the superior human beings that by default will make better decisions because they're superior by the logical distinction that was made at the beginning of the theory. And so that the struggle of Marx is that he, in order to make his argument, he first has to assume there is a class, and then suddenly the class is not there anymore, and everyone lives happily together. And that was the paradox that Popper discovered, and that he was actually helping us work through in his writings.
But sorry, I tried to explain that when Popper was disagreeing with essentialism, he disagreed with a number of different things, and I was simply wanting to argue that there is one element, namely that one could introduce realism in the sense of notions of structural constraints in the social sciences without saying anything about certain knowledge or anything of that kind. And I think that Popper spotted that in Marx and rejected it. And I think that in doing that, Popper made a mistake. And I think it's a bad mistake, because you end up in Popper with him emphasizing, which is certainly significant, piecemeal social engineering, but the method that he advocates is essentially that we should see across the people with different values and concerns what we all think is problematic, and then have that on the agenda to be addressed by tentative government action. And what I'm saying is, no, you can have the possibility of tentative knowledge in the social sciences, which says just because you all would like this, doesn't mean that it's actually something that you can get. I mean, it's like bloody Boris Johnson and cakeism. I mean, that's to say that in the social sciences, there may be things which you can't both have and, in the sense of consuming, and also have to enjoy and contemplate. And this dimension, which is a key aspect of a Marxist approach, seems to me to disappear in Popper. I mean, he kind of talks a little bit about knowledge, but this notion that the unintended consequences of actions which we're all taking may then create structures which constrain what else we can try and do at the same time, seems to me not to be there in Popper's work, and I think it should go back into Popper.
All right, Jeremy, I'm going to think about your question, sorry, about your answer, and then I will get back to you maybe via an email,
okay,
because
that's fine, no worries. Now, yeah. I've got, sorry, John, is this the re-entry of your hand? John? Okay. Apparently not. Philip, then.
Just very quickly on Telos and Popper. I mean, you do have clearly a sense in which there is progress in his later theories. You have a sense of World 3 being an emergence from earlier forms of matter and possibly of consciousness, for example. But most notably in the earliest works of Popper, political works of Popper, you have this concept of the open society as a progression from the closed society, and you know, it's not that it's unidirectional. It could relapse into barbarism, which, by the way, Marxism also recognized. There's no necessary advance in capitalism. In a singular, you know, you could have a relapse to earlier forms of barbaric oppression. But you reckon there is this sense that there is a direction, a desirable direction, not a scientifically determined direction, but it is not absent from Popper's work, and I think we kind of we kind of brush that under the carpet to maximize the apparent contrast between the positions he's rejecting. And I think that what Popper's engagement with Marxism was most directly designed to do, as had Bernstein's engagement, was to separate the Hegelian and perhaps the Platonic entanglements that Marxism so often had. And there is a criticism of Marxism where Marxism remains in the weeds of Hegelianism, for want of a better term. But let's I'll take that as my last contribution. But there we are.
I really disagree with you, just in the sense that it seems to me that the crucial thing is the issue of an intrinsic teleology to history, which operates independently of our wishes, but where our wishes, just as it were, simply further it. And it's this that Popper takes on, and by contrast, he keeps emphasizing what happens is our responsibility.
Yes.
So
Marx also, though. I mean, Marx said men make their own history.
Yes, of course,
there is that critical active component.
Yes, well, there is the critical active component, But I mean, if you take away the teleology from Marx, you make him into, on that stuff, into a kind of pragmatist, and where what is distinctive of Marx is really this notion that, I mean, and this goes very much back to Hegel, that it's not, as it were, a matter of our subjective wishes, concerns, and values, but what really is going on is the disclosure of the meaning that is intrinsic in history. And it's this which really seems to me to be the dividing point between the Marxian tradition and other forms of socialism.
Right. I think Marx has both a kind of Hegelian coding, which was incorporated, but there is also this sense in which there is no certainty in although there are occasional rhetorical references. There's also the sense that the emancipation of the working class is the work of the working class itself. It's up to the working class to set its own future. In the Civil War in France, he says we have no utopias, no ready-made utopias. Popper, by the way, in a footnote in the Open Society, criticizes Marx for saying there are no ready utopias. He says, why don't the Marxists have, why doesn't Marx offer a blueprint or a utopia at that very point? I mean, Popper is inconsistent in his criticism, and I think some Popperians need to recognize that inconsistency rather than say it's nice and neat and there's this clear separation.
I apologize. No. I mean, here is clearly the beginning of a deep disagreement, but I think it has to be taken up further on another occasion. I mean, I'd say really, I in some respects couldn't disagree with you more, because I think once one gets rid of teleology, then it's incumbent on one to offer an account of what one is aiming to do and what constraints we're operating under. And what you're doing is giving that aspect of Marx, which was taken up by the non-theoretical bit of the New Left, who I would see as being, up there with the fascists, basically.
Well, good God, no. Thank you so much. I won't be so much for guilt by the association, but I don't think that is quite right. I think what you have is precisely what you mentioned: a concern with proletarian misery, and what you have in Popper is a concern with misery minimization. You have a kind of negative set of benchmarks, if you will. I won't call them criteria or anything of that, but you have this effort to negate suffering and to negate in particular the material impoverishment and suffering of the vast majority of people. And that is a common ground that motivates both of them to look for, quote, progress, unquote. In other words, to look for social forms that are free of those particular entanglements. Jeremy, I apologize. I came back and I didn't.
No, it's absolutely, it's absolutely fine. But what I'd say is we should conceivably at a future Popper conference set up to have an exchange just exactly on this stuff, because I think it'd be good fun.
Yes.
Time has now run away. Thank you all very much. If anyone has got unanswered questions or objections or spots points which I have glossed over and which I shouldn't have been allowed to get away with, come after me hard. And I'd say once again, as Ali Reza is there, I would agree completely with him about Popper actually letting Kant on history off much too easily. In fact, not discussing something which clearly is to be found there. Although what actually that stuff meant in Kant and how one understands it really, I think, poses a whole lot of other interpretative problems. I mean, what sort of knowledge the teleology in Kant can be, I could say God only knows, but with that, I'll stop. Thank you all very much. And for next week, it's going to be something which will stir Philip up again, because I'm going to be talking about Popper and politics. Thank you all so much.
See you.
Thank